Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Virtual Center is led by Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this ongoing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to today's Tuesday edition. It is the 24th day of June in the year 2014. It is a pleasure to be with you. Not having a program on time yesterday was my doing. I had an appointment with a website developer, and I've begun that process here at the Virtual Center. So I'm hoping that missing yesterday's program will actually turn out to be something that'll be very good down the line. It is a pleasure to be with you today. I hope that your day and your week and your summer is going as well as is mine. I want to thank you for tuning in to the Virtual Center. I look forward to being with you. I look forward to hearing from you. Let me once again remind you that we do have a phone line that is reserved for your use. It will get you on the air. The number is area code 304-574-8178. That's 304-574-8178. If you'd like to email me directly about the issues we're dealing with or issues we've dealt with in the past, or perhaps a suggestion as issues that we should deal with, I would love to hear from you, and I'll do the very best I can to respond to you as quickly as I can. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906, all one word, @gmail.com. I received an email yesterday. This is kind of an introduction to today's program in a way. Today, the 24th of June, for me is a day I've been waiting a year for, if that makes sense. I, for the last year, have been president of our local Rotary Club here in Southern West Virginia, and this evening at a dinner event, we will have installation of new officers in our Rotary Club. So I will cease to be president of the Beckley Rotary Club as of this evening. One of the positives, and there are many, but one of the positives that I've gotten out of this last year of being president of this Rotary Club is, first of all, becoming much more aware of and appreciative of the value and the principles of Rotary. That's the first thing. And the second thing is I've gotten to know some pretty nice people, and I mean that. And one of them, probably the nicest of all, is our local district governor, who has been a friend of mine for a number of 4 or 5 years, named Harry Falk. He was at a sister college here in Southern West Virginia up until this year. He's now district governor of Rotary, and as of July 1st, he'll no longer be district governor either. One of the things that Harry has done is he sends out a weekly newsletter to all the club presidents in the district. I think we have 27 Rotary clubs in our district here in Southern West Virginia. We're actually one of the smaller districts in Rotary International, but that's because of where we are, obviously, in Southern West Virginia. We've got some very small clubs. The Beckley Rotary Club has about 75 members, and I believe it's the third largest in the district, if that gives you some sense. The largest clubs are obviously Huntington and Charleston, which is the state capital. They obviously have larger clubs than we do, but we are third. And what Harry does in his weekly update is bring us news from Rotary and from Rotary International and a number of things. Anyway, yesterday, in his last weekly address as district governor, Harry sent us excerpts from a speech delivered by Ron Burton. Ron Burton is the outgoing president of Rotary International, and the International Convention of Rotary for 2013-2014 was held in Sydney, Australia. And in this email, 2 or 3 paragraphs or comments by President Ron Burton were sent to me, and I flagged one, and I'll explain why. It's not directly related to today's program. On the other hand, I'm thinking it might be related to tomorrow's program. This is what Rotary President Ron Burton said. Being a Rotarian isn't about our own achievements. It isn't about our own careers. It really isn't about us at all. It's about the people we help. At the end of the day, the only thing that matters in Rotary is how much better the world becomes because Rotary is in it. How much better the world becomes because Rotary is in it. And some of you may know that one of the big pushes, one of the big campaigns of Rotary International is the eradication of polio in the world. And it looked like we had it on the run until this situation in Syria, because now there has been an outbreak of polio in Syria, and we can't, because of the traumatic situation there, nobody can get in to address it. Excuse me. So we may be looking at a spurt, hopefully a final gasp of polio in the world. But one of the things that I wanted to suggest, and it relates to a previous program, but also one that I think we really need to revisit, and I may do that tomorrow, is the definition of happiness that we were considering several weeks ago as it had meaning in the 17th and 18th century. One of the things that, when we were doing our PRISM grant a few years ago, John Kaminsky, who heads up the ratification of the Constitution project at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, John Kaminsky, in talking to our teachers, was talking about how the meaning of words changes as we go from one era to another. And the example he used was the word happiness. And he said, if you want to really get some insight on how language and meaning of words changes over the years, go to the Rotunda site, which is all the primary source materials from the 18th century and from ratification, and just look up the word happiness and see how people use it and what it means in the 17th and 18th centuries. Well, we did that here at the Virtual Center several weeks ago. And we did it in the context of Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, the pursuit of happiness. And the reason that we did it, and I plan to revisit it because I really do believe that this is very significant. The reason that it needed to be revisited is because many people with a political agenda, with a very specific political agenda, have taken Jefferson's phrase, pursuit of happiness, and assigned contemporary meaning to it, which fits their agenda. Basically, the more conservative approach to the Declaration, those who are conservatives and who are looking for guidance and support within Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, look at Jefferson's mention of unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and are more than willing to assign meaning to that. And because they assume, and I'm not saying that they are wrong, I'm saying, but because they assume that the major impetus for Jefferson's Declaration of Independence came from John Locke, then they logically assume that when Jefferson mentioned pursuit of happiness, he was really talking about pursuit of property, wealth, success, material benefits. And so this becomes part of an ongoing saga that the right chooses to develop around Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. Jefferson really wanted to emphasize as a natural right the right to pursue property and the right to have it protected, and thereby to assign government's principal responsibility as the protection of citizens' natural rights, which would include the protection of private property and protection of the freedom to pursue it. In other words, they have taken Jefferson out of the 18th century and they have very shrewdly moved him into the 21st century in an effort to see that his declaration seems to embrace the so-called neoliberal agenda in social, economic, and political objectives that the right seeks. Well, the fact of the matter is, if you go back to the 17th and 18th century and you look at the meaning of happiness, you discover that happiness really didn't relate to what you had or what you wanted. Happiness related to what you could do for others. And it's very significant that when Jefferson includes pursuit of happiness in his declaration, despite efforts to argue to the contrary, Jefferson did not specifically mean property. And in fact, if you find and look at Jefferson's first draft of the Declaration of Independence, he includes property and happiness in the same sentence. So in a sense, what we're suggesting is that to Jefferson, happiness did not revolve around the amount of property that one had. Happiness, rather, referred to one's ability to do good for those around him, for the community at large. Gary Wills, in his book, Inventing America, picks up on this and looks in some detail at the Scottish Enlightenment and the names of political theorists, Scottish political theorists, in the 17th and 18th century: Hutcheson, Reed, Adam Smith. There's another, and I'm stuck for a name, another major name. But anyway, and Gary Wills points out that in the Scottish Enlightenment tradition, when you talk about self-evident truths, which is another very prominent, poignant phrase in Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident. The Scottish Enlightenment was quick to point out that self-evident truths are not specifically those things that one's reason leads him to conclude as an individual. Rather, self-evident truths are the things that the community at large believes without question. If they are self-evident truths, that means that they are evident not only to you, but to those around you. And so basically what this suggests is that it's really important to focus a little bit more attention on what the founders were saying and not be too quick to jump to conclusions and assign meanings to words and phrases and principles and concepts that pertain more to today's world than to the world that produced those words, those ideas. I wanted to share with you Ron Burton's statement about Rotary, because one of the things that has attracted me to Rotary over the years is the fact that Rotary emphasizes more than anything else help for others and assistance to others. Rotary began as a social group of businessmen. It began in Chicago in the early 20th century. Rotary spoke to the social consciousness of business. Oh, if only we could resurrect a focus on that same social consciousness today. In fact, this is where we're going to be going in today's program. But tomorrow, if you would bear with me, I'd like to get a little bit into Hutchison and David Hume is the other name that I was thinking of. Hutchinson, David Hume, Thomas Reed, Adam Smith. And of course, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations as the model of free enterprise capitalism and a limited, refined, defined role for government is usually not considered in this context. But Adam Smith was part of the Scottish Enlightenment tradition, and as such, he bought into the assumptions and the priorities of that way of looking at the world. And I think, unfortunately, people have gone to Adam Smith and pulled out what they want to pull out. His story about the pins and about the invisible hand and all of these other things that economists focus on. And we tend to lose sight of the fact that Adam Smith believed a lot of other things that don't get the traction and the attention that I believe they deserve. So that's really one of the reasons why we're here at the Virtual Center, is to begin to look more carefully and to begin to question some of the interpretations and some of the meanings that have come to us without question, without any question or any examination. We just assume things to be true because everybody we know says they're true. In other words, they're self-evident truths to us. And so the question is, what were the self-evident truths in the 17th and 18th century? Were they necessarily the same truths that we abide by and accept today? One other issue that I'd like to touch upon before we get into what I hope will be the substance of today's program. I want to recommend an article, an op-ed piece that is in this morning's Washington Post. It's written by a regular contributor to the Washington Post, Richard Cohen. I think it's worth a read. Just dial WashingtonPost.com, go to the opinion section, and there you will see today's article by Richard Cohen. In fact, if you click Richard Cohen, you'll get a whole list of the articles he's written for the past several years. He's been with the Washington Post for some time. Cohen's article in today's Washington Post speaks to World War I. He points out that 4 days from now, on the 28th of June, we will celebrate the 100th anniversary of the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand and his wife, the Austrian Archduke, and the outbreak of World War I, 100 years ago this week. Based on that anniversary, Richard Cohen writes his article on the value and the questions raised by World War I that still make World War I a topic for discussion and investigation. He points out that by the end of the summer of 1914, 100 years ago, Europe was engaged in a war that lasted 4 years. It toppled 4 empires. It helped to precipitate the Communist Revolution. It created the modern Middle East, which I think is significant. It officially recognized Zionism. the quest of the world's Jews for homeland. It made the United States a world power, and in the process, it cost the lives of 10 million fighting men from the various countries. And as Cohen points out at the end of his first paragraph, historians are still trying to figure out what happened. But talk about a war that had unbelievable significance in the 4 years that it persisted. Toppled 4 empires, precipitated communist revolution, created the modern Middle East, recognized Zionism, made the United States a world power, and cost the lives of 10 million fighting men. Then he points out, and I think many of us realize this, that there are theories galore on what caused it and who's responsible for it. Many insist, obviously, that Germany was to blame. No, say some, it was Austria-Hungary. Maybe Russia. On the other hand, could have been Serbia. Or it could have been the military mobilizations, the armament race that existed in Europe at the time as each of these Western nations, European nations, felt the need to mobilize militarily and to streamline their technology and their travel and their communications. As Richie Cohen says, those damn railway schedules, the insanity of nationalism run amok, the fact that people's patriotism for their own mother country at that time was so intense that they were unwilling to give any others their due. They were unwilling to make the kinds of compromises that would have been necessary in order to prevent the war from breaking out. And of course, one of the things that probably caused it, and I'm a fan of this, I tend to believe this, one of the things that probably contributed to its cause as much as anything else is the belief that it would never happen. That given the high-powered technology that was available, the potential for slaughtering one's fellow man by the hundreds and by the thousands was there as never before in any previous war. The assumption is that the price would be so horrendous that civilized people would never be willing to pay it. But as we know, they were more than willing. And finally, Cohen makes another point, and I think a lot of people have focused on this in examining the origins of World War I. Many people believed that working people in Europe would never go to war so that the upper classes and the industrialists could make money. Most people believed that this war was as much as anything else perpetrated and inflicted upon the continent of Europe by munitions makers and capitalists who saw the opportunity to make profit. So as Cohen says, there are as many theories as to what caused World War I as there are people willing to come up with one. And of course, many people see World War I as kind of the birth of World War II. And they see World War II because of the characters involved, Hitler and FDR and Stalin and Churchill. They see, World War II is much more colorful. It has heroes and personalities. World War I is just trench warfare and death and poison gas and all these horrendous, inhuman things we don't think about. One of the things that Cohen raises which he assigns specifically to World War II, is the issue of evil. What we saw in World War II with the Holocaust and some of the other things associated with it is evil that the world had not seen before, as peoples were trying to obliterate other peoples. Genocide. Hannah Arendt, after the Holocaust, said that the issue of evil was going to become one of the major challenges of our times. And what Cohen points out is, if you remember 10 years ago, 11 years ago, during the march to the war in Iraq, we used the issue of evil again. President Bush used the evil by talking about the war against Iraq as being a crusade against evil itself. Remember President Bush's use of the phrase, the axis of evil. And Cohen makes the point, Saddam Hussein may have been ruthless, but when one starts to consider the rogues gallery of evil, Saddam was really an underachiever. And those are Cohen's words, not mine. I think they're brilliant. And World War I lacked much of that. World War I, had people obviously involved, but they weren't as colorful and as flashy and as newsworthy as some of the people that came to the fore during World War II. Cohen says that World War I was a war about confusion, about complexity, trade, naval armaments, and of course, nationalism. He says it was a war about the prosaic. The prosaic is not pretty, in other words, about the mundane. It was a war about what happened in miniature after September 11th, when we went looking for a fight. It was a war of unintended consequences, one step leading to another, and then to a kind of mad lust rising up amongst the people. Once the war began, it became almost impossible to end. If there was evil there, and there obviously was, it was in the souls of people who suddenly wanted to kill perfect strangers for reasons we're not quite sure of. And this is my point. Cohen makes the connection between that and the contemporary current situation in Iraq, as Iraq seems to be disintegrating right before our very eyes. He points out that the situation in Iraq is very much like Europe in prior to World War I. It's breaking apart. Jordan and Lebanon are endangered. This litany is scary when you look at it in this context. Iraq is breaking apart. Its border with Syria is almost non-existent. Jordan and Lebanon are endangered. The Israeli-Palestinian situation threatens, once again, real violence. 3 Israeli children, youngsters, have been kidnapped from the West Bank. Another has been killed near the Syrian border. Egypt has descended once again to military rule. Libya teeters. Yemen is at war with itself. And Syria threatens to become even more of an issue than it has been. We have no idea how many lives were lost. I mean, look at the situation of the world in the Middle East as it exists today. And Cohen is right. The analogy with World War I, with Europe prior to World War I, is incredibly close, it seems to me. Cohen says, evil concerns us all. The ultimate in evil, the Holocaust, stalks me constantly, he says. I know what happened. Therefore, I know what can happen. I'm sometimes quick to urge action to smother evil in its crib. And then Cohen makes an admission. I thought President Obama should have intervened in Syria. I still do. Now, though, the situation has been folded in on itself. What a beautiful way to say this. Now, though, the situation has been folded in on itself many times over. Foreign policy as origami. Obama's caution serves us well here. This is not a crisis made by a man or even by men. It's made by movements. It's like a flu. The challenge is to not make it worse. I think this is very profound because, as you know, there are a lot of people now who are urging a return of American military to Iraq. This past weekend, as you know, Dick Cheney has kind of reappeared. Cohen says in his concluding paragraph, World War I instructs, maybe its origins will never be divined. Maybe its cause is in the mentality of men who are long gone and who felt so keenly about matters that no longer mean anything to us. In World War II, the search for evil is easy. In World War I, it's harder to find. Maybe that's because it begins and ends with all of us. Maybe we are, potentially, the source of evil in the world to come. I think this is an incredible essay written by Richard Cohen. The fact that Richard Cohen writes two pieces a week, maybe three, but I believe it's two, columns a week in the Washington Post and has been doing so for years. The fact that he would come up with something this profound on this particular anniversary of World War I think is incredible. I think the article displays his ability to write and write well. But more important, I think he has a lot to say about the situation going on in the Middle East right now and the extent to which we can learn a whole lot from the circumstances that brought about World War I. In other words, if we will consult the past, consult history, we can learn from it. Too often the danger is that we're never willing to do that. So again, let me recommend this article. I think this one's a keeper. I think it's a fine job. I think it's provocative in what it suggests and what it says, and I think it's well worth a read. Again, before we get into what I think will be the substance of today's program, we've just gone beyond the bottom of our first hour here. It's 1:34 in the East. Let me share with you again our phone number and invite you to weigh in on some of these issues here on the Virtual Center. The number is area code 304-574-8178. 304-574-8178. I didn't anticipate that we would be into the issue of education again so soon here at the Virtual Center. But over the past 4 or 5 days, there have been a number of issues that have come up and received comment that I think really merit our attention here at the Virtual Center. Over the entire life of this program, we have been focusing off and on the issue of inequality and the extent to which it is getting worse in today's America. Frequently, in the course of those discussions and those considerations, we've been drawn, as well we should be, to education. Because most of us grew up believing and still believe that in a society such as ours, the opportunities associated with freedom, with liberty, with human freedom, are directly related to the quality of education that one receives. I don't mean at all that one should, or that I am, looking at education principally as the means to get a good job or to launch a career. Obviously, that's important. In today's world, nobody can afford the luxury of not thinking about and thinking seriously about how he or she plans to earn a living and to become self-sufficient and self-supporting. I think all of us must devote a time and attention to that subject. But on the other hand, I hope that over the months here at the Virtual Center, we've become appreciative of the consideration of the fact that education involves much more than that. More than once, I have said, and I believe this firmly, that more than anything else, education is what teaches us how to be human. Our humanity, our consideration for others, our willingness to tolerate other ideas and other ways of looking at the world is directly dependent on the quality of education we receive. I believe, and I think this has become very clear in the course of our programs, I believe that man's humanity is defined within the context of the community in which he lives. I believe all of us are informed by and defined by the quality of life that not only that we enjoy, but that those around us are able to enjoy as well. In a sense, I guess what I'm saying is that I personally subscribe to the Scottish Enlightenment idea of happiness. I believe that what makes us human is our ability and our willingness to help others and to be considerate of others. Because I really believe that a community that does that becomes a richer community for everybody in it. The lifestyle that I hope to enjoy is enhanced the more people there are who subscribe to that same principle. If you think about it, if people around me genuinely care about me and about my quality of life, how can my quality of life not be enhanced? And the same thing works the other way around. It doesn't make any sense to suggest anything else. The point is then that there's no question that education is a key to what makes this nation tick. There's absolutely no question. There's also no question that the founders agreed with that. We have seen quote after quote from the Jeffersons and the Madisons and the Washington and the Adamses and the rest of it about the extent to which knowledge and education and the ability to intelligently address problems and set out to solve them is what makes this society unique. So therefore, if we as a society are seriously challenged by a problem like inequality, and indeed I would suggest we are, then it seems to me the issue of education is directly related to that. There's no question that the equality of opportunity that all of us speak about and all of us believe in is contingent directly on education. We also know that there has been through the years, from the very beginning, disagreement as to how to translate those ideals into reality. It's one thing to say that society will be improved when the quality of education improves. But the challenge is, how do you translate that into the real thing? How do you make it happen? And throughout, there have been debates over education. And one of the things we've looked at, and looked at in depth here at the Virtual Center, is the seeming contradiction among the founders about education on the one hand and the masses of citizens on the other. Many people genuinely believed that high-quality education was something that only the few could handle. On the other hand, the very survival of the nature itself, the commitment of citizens to the republic, the recognition that being a citizen in a republic carries with it certain distinct responsibilities, and the belief that public education is the mechanism best suited to address those responsibilities. Benjamin Rush spoke about the need in our schools to create little Republican machines. Jefferson talked in Virginia in the 1770s about the creation of public education where the taxpayers would support an education system where everybody sent their children for 3 years. And at the end of that 3-year period, all but the boy of best genius would be dismissed. In other words, by exposing the entire population to the challenges and the competitiveness of education, the assumption is that talent will rise to the surface. Ability, like cream, will rise to the top. And Jefferson, in his proposal, even made mention of what he called annual skimmings of the cream of ability. And the residue dismissed. And then Jefferson talked about what the 3 years for the vast majority of citizens would mean. What is it that students would have learned during that 3-year mandatory educational experience? And one of the things he says in his legislation is that the seeds of future order will be laid there. We will teach the responsibilities and the obligations of citizenship. Citizens will know what's expected of them. They'll know what to look for. They'll know what to expect from their leaders. They'll know what to expect from their society. Excuse me. More important than that, they will become self-sufficient. They will become better able to take care of their own needs rather than look to other people to supply those needs for them. We've talked about this a lot. We spent a lot of time with the Otto letter to Count Vergennes in France, where Otto talks about how public information, political information, is understood on different levels by different classes of people. And we talked about the fact that what seemed to be emerging in the minds of the founders was the idea that what we needed in a republic was a dual system of education. A system of education that would meet the needs of the leaders, the potential leaders. Also, an education system that would meet the needs of the followers. And one of the principal characteristics of the education for the masses is that it would instill in the masses the recognition of talent and the willingness to follow the leaders. The thinking was this was the best way to promote and pursue a viable republic. So in a sense, what we're talking about here is the fact that throughout our history we've effectively maintained two systems of education, one for the few and one for the many. And when we've talked about the extent to which education is the ticket to the equal opportunity that our society promises, most people tend to look at Jefferson's annual skimmings of the cream of ability as that. In other words, if you are amongst the most talented, you too will be able to derive the benefits of high-quality, high-powered, challenging education in our society. But the other side of that coin was, it was not thought to be wise to inflict a level of education on the masses that they were incapable of handling and handling well. And out of that, in the 19th century, comes this idea of student-focused education, where you tailor the level of education to the presumed destination of the student. And increasingly, with industrialism in the society, the assumption is that most people are going to find jobs in industry. Therefore, the kind of education they receive needs to be the kind of education which fits them more comfortably into an industrial frame of reference, an industrial way of looking at the world. And our entire education system is modeled on that same model. Classes are timed, students are made very sensitive to time. Classes begin and end with the ringing of a bell. Students are encouraged to walk in line. Military discipline becomes kind of the model of the modus operandi, the day-to-day operations in our schools. And so therefore, when students leave school and move into industry, they'll be very comfortable with the routine that they most likely will find themselves in. And one of the things that we've addressed is the extent to which the challenges of the 21st century, more specifically the communication revolution and the technological revolution, defined more than anything else, I would say, by the internet, are materially changing. These kinds of technological advances are materially changing the world in which our students will have to function. And one of the things that seems to be confounding us is our ability to make the upgrades in education that will adequately meet the challenges of the world that our students will be asked to engage. Technology and the communications revolution has brought peoples into the equation in terms of making them competitors for the best jobs that never before were even considered. Technology has effectively put the United States back into a level of competition for excellence that Americans are not used to engaging in, and we're not doing too well. As the world seems to become more demanding in the areas of math and science, we find fewer and fewer of our students who can do that. I just saw a report this weekend that said that actually in higher education, the number of computer science majors graduating from our colleges and universities is going down in a world where success almost demands that it go up. Not only success for the individual in terms of job success, but also the success of the nation as a whole in order to find and hone the talent that this nation is going to need. And what we have found, what we have found in our investigations through the months is that we are facing a real crisis in our education. Because there has always been an operative assumption that the masses of people could not handle quality education, could not profitably handle exposure to ideas and concepts and principles that they really in the past never had to know before. These are the kinds of consideration that the leadership would take care of. Basically, what we're finding, I think, this is me talking more than anything else, what we're finding is the world that we see ourselves entering is one in which we can no longer successfully meet the challenges of today's world, tomorrow's world, by only educating 15 to 20% of our population. Somehow, we are going to have to maximize the talent and the cognitive skills and the abilities of everybody. We can no longer continue to throw 4 of every 5 of our students, I was going to say into the trash heap, but I know many people would be insulted if I say that. I don't mean it that way. But Jefferson used the term raked from the rubbish, so he was more than willing to use that term. But basically what I mean is that if we are going to meet the technological needs that confront us as a nation, then we're going to need more than the 15, 20, or 22% coming out of our high-powered colleges and universities in this country. We're going to need more talent. And we've got to turn our education system into an engine that will help us not only identify that talent, but help us develop it. And that's what we've been looking at with the Common Core standards. The idea of nationalizing our standards and asking all of our youngsters to meet higher standards, higher quality. The idea being that this is the most efficient way for us to basically satisfy the needs of the future and the needs of the nation. In a sense, then, we've got about 4 minutes left in this hour. What I'd like to do in our second hour today is spend some time examining this situation. And the way to do it, I believe, is to make reference to an absolutely wonderful piece that was available in today's New York Times on education and educational reform that is taking place in Great Britain, in Birmingham, England. Because I believe the challenges that these schools are facing are the same kinds of challenges that we're facing here in America. And I believe that this particular article lays out much more clearly than I can explain it exactly what it is that seems to be holding us back in our approach to education. What are we doing that we need to do differently? What are we not doing that we should be doing? And even more important than that, why aren't we doing it? We've had some of our best minds employed for long periods of time on this particular issue. Why can't we solve it? What are the hang-ups? How deep is this belief that the vast majority of our students are incapable of handling the kind of education that our world is increasingly demanding of its people? I think that what we'll see in this little piece on Birmingham, England, is an indication of some of the things that hold us back and some of the reasons why we aren't doing what we need to do. I think it's a very, very revealing piece. And where I'd like to go from that is to move from that to our colleges and universities, to higher education, and suggests that many of the problems that we have experienced in our K through 12 education systems are now visiting higher education as well. Our colleges and universities, to a large degree, are, I believe, in crisis. I really think that we need to become much more conscious, much more aware of what we're doing in education, and more important, why we feel like we need to do it. I really believe that the answers are there if we will but look for them. We're at 59 minutes after the hour. Let's pause and take a 5-minute break right now, and then we'll come back and we'll begin to look at this article about Birmingham, England, and then we'll get into some of the issues confronting higher education in America. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. I'm Bill O'Brien, and after a 5-minute break, we'll be right back. Please stay with us.
Here's your host, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid. You didn't even wait for me to tell you I was ready. But that's okay, I was.
I'm psychotic that way.
I'll tell you. It's great. Hey, Bob, thank you, and thank you all for staying with us. If you've been with us through the first hour here at the Virtual Center, I want to thank you for staying with us. If you are just joining us, we spent a little bit of time on a couple of different topics. One of them, and I want to recommend this if you are just joining us, the piece in the Washington Post today, it's the 24th of June, by Richard Cohen on World War I, on the 100th anniversary of the outbreak of World War I this week. And his analysis between the circumstances that brought the world into World War I and the circumstances currently happening in the Middle East. I think it's astounding if we'll only learn from a little bit of it. I invite you to participate actively in our program. We do have a phone number, and it's there primarily for your use. The number is area code 304-574-8178. That's 304-574-8178. My email address, if you'd like to communicate with me directly, waobrien906 at gmail.com. That's waobrien906 at gmail.com. In previewing our second hour today, I made reference to an article that is on the op-ed page, in the opinion page in this morning's New York Times. The author is Keenan Malik, M-A-L-I-K. Keenan Malik is a broadcaster, is an opinion writer for the New York Times on occasion, and has recently written a book entitled The Quest for a Moral Compass, A Global History of Ethics. And what Keenan Malik writes about this morning are the changes brought about in the Birmingham, England schools in order to meet the perceived threat of Islamic terrorism. The results of the analysis that Malik provides suggests a cure, I'm paraphrasing James Madison here, suggests a cure that just might be worse than the disease. Because in the process of beefing up our schools to meet a perceived challenge, we may be in effect costing ourselves the kind of high-quality education that the nation and the world needs in the 21st century. So, if you will, I don't want to basically do anything to Malik's argument, so I'm going to rely heavily on it, but I'll try to make comments as I can go in order to make this thing become real. I believe it's real. I've read the thing 3 times because I found it to be that rich. I hope you do as well. Anyway, the byline is London. And Malik says the following as his opening. Last year, the council in Birmingham, Britain's second largest city, received an anonymous document that supposedly advised militant Muslims on how to take over the governing bodies of state-run schools and impose Islamist values. So again, what prompts this article is that last year in Birmingham, England, the nation's second largest city, the school system received an anonymous document directed or addressed to militant Muslims on the strategies for taking over the governing bodies of state-run schools and to impose Islamist values in the schools. Malik refers to this as a Trojan horse plot. It was reported last March. It has, Malik says, become the center of a national controversy in Great Britain. And Malik begins by admitting the obvious. The original document was almost certainly a hoax. No such document existed. But something profoundly happened in the Birmingham schools in order to address this perceived threat. What exactly, Malik says, has largely been lost in the fog of ideological dispute. The Trojan horse affair in Birmingham has become, Malik says, an illustration of the debate about Islam and about the contradictory character of public policy in the nation at large. The government's initial response, Malik says, to begin an inquiry led by a former police counterterrorism expert, whose name is Peter Clark, suggested that the issue was as much about terrorism as it was about the values of education, about educational values. In other words, Malik is pointing out the obvious here, that when you see something addressed about militant Muslims, the assumption is that you're on the verge of dealing with terrorism. So even though the issue at hand is educational values, the issue of getting the most attention is the threat of terrorism. Since then, Malik says, 4 other official inquiries have investigated some 21 schools in Birmingham. So the results, the reaction to this document, which was originally a hoax, has produced official inquiries into what's going on in 21 schools in Birmingham as a result. 2 of these inquiries by Britain's school inspectorate, so-called, it's called Ofsted, and by the Education Funding Agency, another government regulator, recently published reports. They painted a grim picture. 5 of the 21 schools were placed in what are called special measures, an administrative term applied to schools that are presumed to be failing. In other words, 5 of the 21 schools, as a result of these inspections or investigations, are now pursuing education that one would probably classify as failure. Another 11 were to be monitored because the quality of leadership and management in them required improvement. So that's 16 of the 21 schools in Birmingham, England, that are in serious trouble. And Malik is linking that trouble to the perceived terrorism threat in the document received last year, which is most likely a hoax. But the fact of the matter is, what the schools did to address this potential threat is in effect destroying the quality of education that is occurring in those schools. The Ofsted report, Malik says, described members of the governing board at one school attempting to, quote, promote a particular and narrow faith-based ideology. So the answer in one school was to redesign curriculum and to promote a very narrow faith-based ideology in the schools as a way to counter this perceived threat of Islam. In another school, certain subjects regarded as un-Islamic, like music, were removed from the syllabus. So in a second school, music was just taken out of the syllabus because it was considered to be un-Islamic. The report also talked about gender segregation in some subjects. None of the 5 schools, the report concluded, were doing enough to mitigate against cultural isolation or to prepare pupils adequately for life in modern Britain. In other words, what the schools did in response to this perceived terrorism threat was circle the wagons. They basically looked at everything in the curriculum that they felt made them vulnerable, and they got rid of it, music being one. They began to segregate the schools on the basis of gender. And they began to teach students in ways which did not prepare them for the life that they were going to face in modern England. So they were reacting in exactly the kind of ways that one might expect, but ways which are contrary to the values and the goals of a quality education. This is me talking at this point, not Malik. I would suggest to you that in my mind, what this suggests to me is the same kind of fear that we've seen here in the United States for a long, long time. Remember, we looked at a bill in the United States Senate to place a tariff on foreign books. This was in 1818, right after the War of 1812 in America. And the spokesman for the United States Senate defended that legislation by saying that one of the responsibilities of government was to protect students from alien foreign ideas, dangerous ideas. The implication being that the students couldn't handle them. So the only way to address that is to not allow the students to be exposed to them. In other words, not educate the students so that they could handle these things, but shield them so that they wouldn't have to. And the question I raise is the same one that Malik raises about modern-day England. How do you educate in this way? If this is the way you operate, how do you educate children in a way which is going to prepare them to function in the world? You are not educating youngsters. You are consciously refusing to, by shielding them from what you don't want them to know or experience. We've done it. We continue to do it. Think of the values. Think of the discussion in America today about the issue of putting God back into the classrooms and responding to the challenges of the world by renewing and reinforcing the kinds of faith-based values that these people believe will best protect the nation from foreign and alien ideas. Why do I take time here at the Virtual Center on this 24th day of June to deal with this article? It seems to me there are two considerations here which I think are incredibly important. The first one is how we respond to threat in our schools. The second one are the assumptions we make about the ability or lack of ability of the majority of our students to deal with new ideas and concepts. Remember the debate, I don't know, this was in the 50s, but there used to be, there were big debates about the structure and the content of textbooks. There still are. State of Texas still has big debates about the selection and the adoption of textbooks in the public schools. But the basic idea is that you've got to keep alien, un-American ideas out of the hands of youngsters, out of our schools. Remember a few months ago we talked about former governor of Indiana, Mitch Daniels, who's now president of Purdue University. And in the governor's office, Mitch Daniels did everything he could do to make sure that history books written by Howard Zinn were not being used anywhere in the state of Indiana, because Howard Zinn's approach to history was considered to be un-American. Again, the way you deal with challenging ideas is not to educate students as to how to handle them, but rather to shield students from being exposed to them. And then expecting these same youngsters to go out into a world which is challenging and complex and rapidly changing and technologically driven. And here we have taken the time given to us to educate these youngsters, and we have squandered it by spending that time teaching them what to believe rather than how to learn and how to think. That's why I believe this article is significant, because it reveals an assumption about the lack of ability of the masses, and thereby suggests that the kind of education they receive must be tailored to this lack of ability. They must be taught what to believe and what's true because they're incapable of figuring it out for themselves. In this day and age, this is suicidal. I think Malik writes this article because he believes, from the perspective of the Birmingham schools, this is suicidal as well. Back to Malik's article. But if the management at these schools is disturbing, Malik says, because they are not preparing students adequately for life in modern Britain, so also is the official response. Although no evidence has been produced to link the Trojan horse affair to terrorism, Ofsted, the study, the two reports, criticized the schools for not taking sufficiently seriously the government's counterterrorism program. In other words, government's response is to assume the worst, terrorism, and to act accordingly. Why should they do this, Malik asks, unless all Muslim children are considered potential terrorists? The report's conclusions seem framed by a political agenda rather than certain schools' need for better governance. In other words, the politics of the nation and the world are finding their way into academic curriculum and policy in the schools. there's no question since 9/11 that there has been kind of an operative assumption in everything we do and everything we hear and everything we say that every Muslim is a potential terrorist. I'm thinking of the story last week at the Heritage Foundation where a Muslim female student at George Washington University took issue with the way that the Heritage Foundation was dealing with Muslims and with the idea of terrorism. And she was chastised and attacked. There's a video on YouTube about Sean Hannity attacking her when she appeared as a guest on his program. Basically what he's saying is, where are the moderate Muslims? If you are a moderate Muslim, then you need to become a radical Muslim. You need to stand up and fight these radicals. And basically what Sean Hannity is doing is criticizing moderates. Malik says what the investigations have revealed is not a jihadist plot, but attempts to enforce conservative religious values. What is particularly ironic is that the government itself has encouraged communities to pursue their values within schools. The state education system has always incorporated a substantial sector of so-called church schools, Catholic and Anglican. Other faiths also receive state funding. There are Jewish schools, Sikh and Hindu schools, and about a dozen Muslim schools. In other words, what he's pointing out is that in England, the state has continued to fund faith-based education. What Malik's article clearly is suggesting are the drawbacks and the downfalls to faith-based education, to an education principally focused on what to believe rather than on the pursuit of truth and the skills to carry out that pursuit. Malik says, in the name of a more diverse school system, the coalition government expanded the policy of the previous Labour government in England to free schools from state control and national curriculum and give parents and school officials greater say in setting a school's ethos. 2 years ago, after criticism of a booklet used by Catholic schools that told pupils that homosexuality is disordered and it is contrary to God's natural purpose, Great Britain's Education Secretary Michael Gove defended the right of schools to promote their own values. In other words, in response to the threat of radical Islam, the schools are responding in a way which is even more anti-educational than they were functioning before the threat. What they are not considering are the benefits and the value of quality education in meeting a threat like this one or a threat like any other one. The way you deal with uncomfortable foreign alien ideas is to equip people to deal with them, not try to protect them from them. It's kind of like the idea of parental control over children's access to the internet. You can only shield people from what's out there for so long. At some point in time, they're going to have to face these situations for themselves. And we're not using the educational experience to prepare them. Back to England, back to Malik's article. Private schools outside the state school system should be, quote, free to teach creationalism and other types of religious teachings, the government has ruled, because of the right of parents to bring up their children as they see fit. These are the same debates that we're having here in America now. Schools need to be free to teach what the parents want in terms of religion and values, because it's the right of parents to bring up their own children as they see fit. Guidelines published earlier this year permit Muslim schools to segregate pupils by sex, restrict the teaching of art and music, and allow girls to wear the hijab as part of their identity and a commitment to their beliefs within Islam. Malik says, if such practices are acceptable in faith schools, why not in all schools where parents may desire them? And if these values were unacceptable in the non-denominational Birmingham schools because they didn't prepare pupils adequately for life in modern Britain, why should they be tolerated in faith schools? He's raising serious questions here. Is the way you deal with perceived threat to strengthen the values and the faith in private schools and to make public schools more like private schools? Is that the way to go? Or is that a cure, as Madison would say, that might be worse than the disease? Malik's analysis says, the Trojan horse story reveals the contradiction in government policy, raising questions not only about the encouragement of faith schools, but also about the approach towards multiculturalism. Policymakers have tended to treat minority communities as if each was distinct and homogeneous, composed of people defined by a single view of culture and faith. Successive governments have managed diversity by putting people into ethnic boxes and using those boxes to shape public policy. In other words, we're making children go to school with the idea that school's going to prepare them to confront the world. But that's exactly what we're not doing. We're preparing them for a world that doesn't exist. A world in which everybody around them is homogeneous and the same and believes the same and worships the same, etc. In other words, I would say that what Malik is showing here is that in Birmingham, England, education is being operated in a way which is counterproductive to the needs of the world. We're consciously trying to protect our youngsters by shielding them from the realities of the world rather than teaching them how to handle it. The operative assumption being that the high-powered quality schools will prepare the leaders. They'll show the way as to how to deal with these things. What we need to do is protect the masses of our people from those ideas until our leaders are ready to lead them. My. He also says that the Trojan horse matter reveals how the public debate about Islam has become polarized between those who think that any problem concerning the Muslim community must involve the threat of terrorism, and those who insist that any criticism of Muslim customs is Islamophobic. Issues of poor leadership at specific schools have become politicized, while the real political problems that help create the mess are ignored. That's Malik's conclusion. I would suggest it's probably mine as well. It seems to me that what we have done is use our idea of local control and community control of schools and parental right to control the education of their own children as ways to shield children from the real world. And then we turn around and wonder why our schools are failing, why our kids can't function, why they can't perform, why they don't know how to deal with different groups and different religions and different races in a multicultural world. When in effect what we have done is take their early years and deny them the opportunity to prepare for them. I think what Moloch has given us in the Birmingham schools is a situation, as he points out, that has become a matter of national controversy. I would suggest it is as well a matter of controversy here in the United States. Our issue, the issue that's on the forefront, that's on the front burner now in America, are the so-called Common Core standards. The Common Core standards were designed to better prepare our youngsters for the world and to give them the skills that they need to educate themselves and to make lifetime a lifetime of continued learning, so-called lifelong learning. I would suggest we are seeing state after state opting out of the Common Core standards and looking to withdraw into their own particular shells. Much of it focused around faith-based issues. Much of it in response to the perceived terrorism threat of Islam. I think we are doing two things here. We are making a bad situation worse, and we are restructuring our education system in such a way that our students, our youngsters, will be incapable of handling that world, that situation. If you think about it, we're doing both. We are at 37 minutes after the hour. We've got about 20 minutes left in our program today. I don't know if I'll be able to get through all of this today. If not, we'll continue it tomorrow. But I'd like to move from this to the issue of higher education in America. Higher education is getting a lot of attention. I hope, and this is the article that I'm going to feature, but in Sunday's New York Times, there was a on Sunday the 22nd, Peter Siebold in truthout.org wrote a lengthy article entitled Servants of Power, Higher Education in an Era of Corporate Control, a criticism of higher education in America that I think all of us need to be aware of, especially in light of what we just looked at in England in Moloch's article. It seems to me that the world we face is moving in one direction, and too often the response we take to deal with that world is heading in the opposite direction. We're seeking to turn our education system into a mechanism to reinforce beliefs and to discourage thought and to discourage intellectualism and to discourage learning and to discourage cosmopolitanism. Our way of preparing our students to deal with the problems of the world is to shield them from those problems. This is not a criticism of anything that's new. This has always been our approach to education for the masses. Back to Jefferson and Benjamin Rush and the idea of a dual system of education. We've got to provide the education for the few in order to prepare them to lead. We've got to provide for the education of the masses in a republic in order to teach them to follow those who lead. In today's world, that approach cannot work. And I think the results that we're seeing in competitive testing with other youngsters throughout the world is bringing that fact home loud and clear. We have got to turn our trust in our own children and educate them as we would like to be educated ourselves, rather than assuming that they are incapable of addressing the same issues and the same problems that the rest of the world is addressing. We cannot continue to do this. Let me share with you a quote on higher education. This is a book by Suzanne Mettler on higher education. The title of her book is Degrees of Inequality. Degrees of Inequality. And what Suzanne Mettler is suggesting is that our higher education system has morphed into a system which is not dealing with the problems of inequality in America, but exacerbating those problems. That our system of education has been changed and reformed to the point that it is promoting a caste system in America rather than promoting a society which is just the opposite. Here's a quote from Suzanne Mettler's book. This is a quote from a piece entitled Polarizing Plutocracy, Our Broken Higher Education System. And it's speaking specifically to Suzanne Mettler in her book. Suzanne Mettler makes the case that the American system of higher education, which once provided a pathway of upward mobility for millions of Americans, is evolving into a caste system with separate and unequal tiers that leaves students more unequal than when they first enrolled, unquote. What she is suggesting is that our system of higher education, instead of being the vehicle to achieve equality of opportunity that it always was envisioned to be in America, is now becoming just the opposite. It's becoming the foundation of and the mirror of a caste system in America. Rather than education being a way to address inequality in America, education is rapidly becoming a way to reinforce and strengthen that caste system. Rather than addressing inequality, the changes being wrought in higher education are in effect exacerbating that very inequality. Kathleen Geyer, who wrote this piece entitled The Baffler, makes the point that our American political system is broken. And the example she uses is our inability to bring down the levels of student debt or to regulate predatory for-profit colleges in America. Her whole point is that what's wrong with higher education in America, as much as anything else, is demonstrated by the explosion of for-profit institutions in higher education. Institutions whose principal purpose is not to educate students, but to make money for stockholders, to pay upper-level administrators exorbitant salaries, and to provide lucrative dividends to stockholders. And consequently, what these institutions find themselves doing, and what our government and our nation is letting them get away with, is the literal bastardization of quality education in America. We are, in effect, allowing the profit motive to turn education in the society into a commodity, into a product that carries a price. And increasingly, fewer and fewer of our citizens can pay that price. Consequently, education is becoming the possession of the few rather than the way to equality of opportunity for the many. Kathleen Geyer says that the biggest fundamental problem with the government's response to this, which is a rating system in order to assess or evaluate the quality of higher education by graduation rates and the salaries that graduates earn and the amount of debt they incur. Kathleen Geyer's point is that the biggest problem with the administration's response in terms of such a rating system is that it presents market principles as the cure for this illness, which is in itself the product of the application of market-mad nostrums in a context where they don't belong. In other words, we have turned education into a market commodity. And the way the administration is choosing to try to get a handle on this stuff is to develop a rating system which is based on the same market mentality. We have allowed our education system to move away from what education has been and needs to be. Here are some statistics that I think are staggering. And this is from Suzanne Mettler's book. Out of 15 colleges investigated by the government GAO, the Government Accountability Office, 13 of the 15 provided deceptive information to applicants that implied guaranteed jobs and inflated earnings for graduates. Recruiters at some schools were ordered to sign up anyone who qualified for a student loan. One recent report, Mettler says, addressed an institution that was enrolling mentally disabled students. One man with a second or third grade reading level was recruited for this for-profit college. Here are the statistics. They are staggering. 94% of for-profit bachelor's degree students borrow, and only 22% manage to graduate. What makes a for-profit institution for-profit is that 94% of the students who goes there must borrow. Only 22% graduate. The for-profit graduates suffer worse outcomes than other college graduates. The median debt in these for-profit institutions when students leave is $33,000 per student. 23% of these students default on their loans within 3 years. Yet the salaries being paid to administrators and the value of the stock of these institutions on Wall Street continues to escalate. And here's the kicker. 86% of the funding for these for-profit institutions comes from public sources, the U.S. taxpayer, student grants and loans, military education programs to the tune of $32 billion a year. That's billion with a B. We have turned America's dependency on education into a commodity. We have internally reformed our colleges and universities into institutions organized around and managed according to market principles. We have resorted to labeling students as consumers and education as a product, as a commodity. Education is not the content taught. Education is what happens to the student upon gaining access to that content, to that information. Education is a process that happens within the learner. Education is not content, it is not substance. Content merely provides the vehicle for education to happen. But when you commodify it, when you make education into a measurable commodity, and you put a dollar value on it, and you make it a for-profit entity, you are taking advantage of the very students who need education the most, especially in today's world. As I mentioned, this past Sunday, the 22nd of June, in Truthout, the website truthout.org, Peter Siebold has written a major study on higher education entitled Servants of Power, Higher Education in an Era of Corporate Control. And basically what Siebold is doing, and this is where we have only about 6 or 7 minutes left in our program today, so I'm not going to get into this except to make this point because we spent a lot of time on this here at the Virtual Center. Siebold begins his study of what's happening in higher education in America today with the Powell Memorandum written in 1971 by former Supreme Court Justice Lewis Powell of Richmond, Virginia. We looked here at the Virtual Center at the Powell Memorandum in detail. We effectively read the entire document. And what Siebold is doing is looking at the impact that the Powell Memorandum has had on what's happening in our colleges and universities in America. And he is pointing out that everything that is happening in higher education today is what was predicted and forecast in the Powell Memorandum. You'll remember that the Powell Memorandum was a personal memo written by Lewis Powell and sent to a good friend of his at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And in this memo, Powell encouraged business to wage a counterattack against the left in American society. Powell's argument, as you'll recall, was that for too long business has stood back and not responded to the challenges of the left, of radicals, most of them housed on our colleges' campuses, against America and its way of life, and against free enterprise, against capitalism, against the profit motive, and everything else that Powell believed America stands for. And what he urged in this memo was a counterattack. He asked the business community to mobilize and to finance conservative foundations the Heritage Foundation was born in response to the Powell Memorandum. He wanted business to mobilize and finance conservative foundations, think tanks, media organizations, and excuse me, and endowed professorships on our campuses in order to carry out a cultural war against radicals. In his memo to the Chamber, Powell urged that business retake control over the media and the university as part of a campaign to alter social and political discourse in America. I would suggest to you Fox News, the Murdoch Empire, the Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute, the Koch brothers, the influence of the Koch brothers in politics, the ingredients of Citizens United. All of these can be traced directly or indirectly to the substance of the Powell Memorandum of 1971. Siebold says the following: in Powell's vision, the goal was not just to blunt the influence of left and progressive forces in America, it was to fundamentally shift the country in a conservative direction by weakening labor unions, attacking the minimum wage, repressing social movements, and recapturing the media and higher education. Here's the agenda: to shift the country in a conservative direction by weakening labor unions, attacking the minimum wage, repressing social movements, recapturing the media, and recapturing higher education. The result of reaction to the Powell Memorandum has been that it has shifted debate to the right. Consequently, it has redefined policy options that are acceptable and available to the major political parties. Democrats now represent policy that is center or right of center in terms of its political alternatives and policy options. Republicans now represent extreme right policy prescriptions. In other words, the whole political spectrum has been shifted, where the middle isn't the middle anymore. The middle is right of center. And the entire political debate. And what this effectively means is that we have allowed the debate to be taken over by corporate America and by spokesmen for the right. We have allowed them to redefine the terms of debate. We have even let them define liberalism in such a way that liberalism has become a straw man and subject to attack. Response to the Powell Memorandum has been very effective and continues to be so. Tomorrow, we'll pursue this subject even more. We'll also spend some time tomorrow addressing the Scottish Enlightenment approach to happiness and self-evident truths as used by Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence. But right now our time is up. We've been here 2 hours. For me, it kind of flew by because I love to talk about this stuff. I want to thank you for being with us. I want to invite you to come back tomorrow. This is Bill O'Brien for the Virtual Center on the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. I want to thank you, and I want to encourage you to continue listening and continue to support the Head On Radio Network. Be safe, and hopefully we'll be back together again tomorrow. Thank you.